The brain is a very complex and mysterious organ. It is entirely responsible for what makes us who we are, our personality, thoughts and feelings. It controls everything we do, but does it also mean that it's always in control? Well, scientists have learned that most of our brain activity happens unconsciously, meaning there are many things that influence our decisions that we aren't even aware of. This raises a pretty big question. Are we really in control, or is our brain controlling us? This documentary will help answer this question by taking a look at the science behind our brains and seeing just how much control we really have. You'll be surprised at what you learn, so make sure to watch until the end. So first off, let's take a look at what happens in our brains when we make decisions. Now, there are a lot of different factors that go into making a decision. We could be making a big life-changing decision or something small and insignificant. But either way, our brains are always working hard to process all the information they receive from our senses and come up with the best course of action. But did you know that most of the activity in your brain happens below the level of consciousness? That means that a lot of what goes into making a decision isn't actually something you're aware of. For example, let's say you're trying to decide whether to buy a new car. You might think about your budget, your needs, and your wants. But your brain is also processing information like how much you like the car, how safe it is, and how much it costs. And it does all of this subconsciously. Now, sometimes our brains make decisions that we don't even realize we're making. For example, if you see a snake, your brain will trigger a fight or flight response before you even realize that there's a snake there. That's because our brains are always scanning for potential danger. And when they find it, they trigger a response automatically. This raises the question, if most of what goes into making a decision happens subconsciously, then are we really in control? After all, we're not even aware of most of it happening. Well, it turns out that we are in control, but maybe not in the way we think. Now, there is a lot of different theories out there about how the brain works and how we make decisions, but one of the most popular theories is called the global workspace theory. This theory suggests that the brain has a central area, kind of like a stage, where information is processed and decisions are made. This area is called the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for things like planning, reasoning, and decision-making. Now, the information that's processed in the prefrontal cortex comes from all over the brain. Our senses, memories, emotions, everything is taken into account when making a decision. But ultimately, it's up to the prefrontal cortex to decide what to do with all of that information. Now, the global workspace theory suggests that the prefrontal cortex doesn't work alone. Instead, it works with other parts of the brain to process information and make decisions. For example, the amygdala is responsible for processing emotions. So when you're making a decision, your amygdala sends information to the prefrontal cortex about how you feel about the different options. The hippocampus is responsible for processing memories. So it sends information to the prefrontal cortex about your past experiences that might be relevant to the decision you're remaking. Ultimately, it's up to the prefrontal cortex to weigh all of this information and make a decision. But that raises another question. If the prefrontal cortex is just a part of the brain, how can it be in control? After all, it's just a bunch of neurons, like everything else in our brain. Well, the answer lies in the connections between the different parts of the brain. You see, the different parts of the brain are connected by a network of neurons. These connections allow different parts of the brain to communicate with each other and work together. The prefrontal cortex has more connections than any other part of the brain. That means that it's able to gather more information from other parts of the brain and use that information to make decisions. In a way, the prefrontal cortex is like the captain of a ship. It's in charge of everything that's going on, but it can't do its job without the crew. The crew is the rest of the brain. They do all the work. But the captain is ultimately responsible for making decisions and steering the ship in the right direction. In fact, studies have shown that people who have damage to their prefrontal cortex have trouble making decisions. They're also more likely to act impulsively. That supports the idea that the prefrontal cortex is in control of our decision-making process. But wait, there's more. Studies have also shown that the prefrontal cortex is active when we make decisions. That means that it's using energy and resources to process information and make decisions. That's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of energy. In fact, the prefrontal cortex uses 20% of the brain's energy. That's more than any other part of the brain. That raises another question. If the prefrontal cortex is using so much energy, where does that energy come from? Well, it comes from our food. When we eat, our bodies break down the food and use the energy to power our brains. The prefrontal cortex takes 20% of that energy, which means that it's constantly getting fed. That's a lot of power, and it shows that the prefrontal cortex is definitely in control. But here's where things get really interesting. The prefrontal cortex isn't the only part of the brain that's active when we make decisions. Other parts of the brain are active too, like the parietal lobe and the insula. The parietal lobe is responsible for processing sensory information, so when you're making a decision, it sends information to the prefrontal cortex about what you see, hear, touch, etc. The insula is responsible for processing emotions and pain, so it sends information to the prefrontal cortex about how different decisions might make you feel. This raises another question. If other parts of the brain are active when we make decisions, then how come we only consciously experience the decision-making process in the prefrontal cortex? Well, it turns out that we don't experience most of the activity in our brains consciously. In fact, 90% of what happens in our brains is outside of our conscious awareness. That means that we are unaware of most of the activity happening in our parietal lobe or insula when we make decisions. We're only aware of the activity in the prefrontal cortex. This raises another question. If we aren't aware of most of what's happening in our brains when we make decisions, then how do we know that our prefrontal cortex is in control? Well, it turns out that we can actually measure the activity in different parts of the brain when we make decisions. Using brain imaging technology like fMRIs, researchers can see which parts of the brain are active and what role they play in decision-making. And here's the amazing thing. Researchers have found that when we make decisions, the parts of the brain that are involved in processing emotions and pain are active in the parietal lobe and insula. But those areas don't send signals to the prefrontal cortex. Instead, the prefrontal cortex sends signals to those areas. That shows that the prefrontal cortex is definitely in control. But there's more. Researchers have also found that the two sides of the brain can sometimes work independently of each other. This is really surprising because we usually think of our brains as one thing. But it turns out that they're actually two things working together. This is really amazing because it shows that we have even more control over our brains than we thought. For example, there's a patient named John. John suffered an injury to his brain that split the two sides apart. As a result, he had two different personalities. One side of his brain was more logical and rational, while the other side was more emotional and impulsive. This is really amazing because it shows that the two sides of the brain can work independently of each other. It also shows that we have even more control over our brains than we thought. John was able to control which side of his brain he used when making decisions. He could choose to be more logical and rational, or more emotional and impulsive. This is really amazing because it shows that we have even more control over our brains than we thought. The two sides of the brain also process visual information differently. The left side of the brain processes the right visual field, and the right side of the brain processes the left visual field. This is really amazing because it shows that we're not always aware of everything that's going on around us. Let S say that you're driving down the road, and there's a car in your right visual field. Your left brain will process that information and send it to the right side of your brain for further processing. But your right brain won't be able to send a signal to your left brain to tell it that it's there. That means that the left side of your brain won't be aware of the car until it's too late. Researchers were actually able to measure this effect in a study. They had participants wear glasses that only allowed them to see visual stimuli in one half of their visual field at a time. Researchers found that participants were more likely to report seeing a stimulus in the visual field that was being processed by the right side of their brain. That shows that we're not always aware of what's going on around us, and that our brains are more complicated than we thought. Our brains are truly amazing organs, and we are still learning new things about them all the time. What do you think? Do you think we're in control of our brains, or are our brains in control of us? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.